Welcome to today's video. Today we're going to be talking about the subject of when the miracles don't come. It's something that I feel led to talk about because it's something that people can hope and believe in something, and suddenly when a miracle doesn't happen in their situation, it really causes them to doubt and have many different things that go on in their life. And so I just really want to share my heart about it, my experience, and just some things that I've learned over the past few years in my journey. So I just really want to kind of define the word miracle is really, by dictionary definition, is a miracle is an extraordinary event manifesting divine intervention in human affairs, or an extremely outstanding or unusual event or thing or accomplishment. And so that whole idea of miracles, it's a thing that, it's really beyond reality that we can understand sometimes, and we have things that happen, but they do happen. They do defy ideas of science and medical knowledge, and they're the great mysteries of our world that we have in our existence. And so for me personally, I grew up, hearing about miracles in the Bible, and later on seeing them for myself. In my own journey, I remember when I was a kid, and I was like 10 years old, and there was this lady I knew in the church, and she had all these health issues and back problems, all these different things. And it was one of the things, like, she used to bring her orthopedic back pillow to sit in the pews because, good old wooden pews. And so I just knew this is what her experience was. And suddenly we had an event where, people were being prayed for healing. And I'm in the pew behind her, and this lady's jumping up and running around the room. And I'm sitting there as like a 10-year-old kid going, what on earth is happening? How is that lady running around? She has all these issues. And it was just really wild. And, I knew this lady. She was the mother of my brother's friend, and, was at their house. So, like, I knew this was legit. Like, this was something real. And, as time goes on and I'm in my teenage years, I knew somebody at Brayside Camp who was a staff, and she had an illness that caused her voice box to get damaged, where she couldn't really talk properly. She could talk in squeaks and just broken words, and it was just a really unusual sickness. And one day I'm hanging out outside the tuck shop and hanging out with some friends, and she walks by me. She's like, "Hey, John, how you doing?" And I just kind of freeze and look at her. She goes, "How are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm good. You can talk." And she kind of laughed and was like, "Yeah, I got prayed for it at the service last night, and I got healed." And it was just like this huge, like, whoa, this is crazy. This is, again, another person that I know. And so through those experiences, it really fueled my belief on that this is real. This can happen. And, you can believe in miracles for different circumstances, and not even just healing, but it's just those are things that were really predominant to me in my experience. And, so years later, flash forward, I'm dating Abby, and, her dad was an alcoholic for over 20 years and had health problems, had organs shutting down, all these different things started happening all at once. And it was just this horrific thing that he's dying. We're supposed to be in the middle of planning our wedding, and it looks like we're going to be planning a funeral. Like, it's all those kind of moments. And, you know, Abby and her family just held on for that miracle. And, Daryl was sent home from Simcoe Hospital basically to die at home. And so it was one of those scenarios. But as he went home, he stopped cold turkey that night. He poured out all the alcohol in the house, poured it down the drain, and God delivered him from alcohol addiction, and restored his body. And as time went on, he didn't die. He ended up getting better. It was a miracle. He went to internists that would do evaluations of his organs, and suddenly all these tests are showing that he looks like a younger person based on that, not somebody who's dying from years of abuse of their body. And it was just this whole thing. And not only did God, deliver him from alcohol addiction, restore his body, but also restored his mind, as he he struggled with anxiety issues for years. And so God healed him of that. He's actually a guy running safety trucks on the side of roads for like major highway construction and things like that. And you know, high stress environments, and he's doing it, and it's just that's a miracle on itself. And so as we continue on, it leads me to the next miracle that's really big in my life, and the fact that I have a twin boy and girl. And Abby and I were told we were never to have any more kids. And Abby and I were trying to get pregnant for so long, and nothing was happening. It was strange because our first two kids came really easy. Everything was fine. It was, you have kids, you're young. And after time we had struggles, and so Abby and I went through medical tests, had to go through the whole gamut of everything, do the fertility clinics, all that stuff. And it was really difficult, especially also during the time of COVID, seeing specialists, but our doctors was able to push some things through, and we got all these tests in good time. And so, we wait for that phone call to get, that information to say, hey, here's all the results, and you're not going to have any more kids. And so we were just told not to expect anything. It was, just bad news. There wasn't options on the table. It was just, that's what it was. And so for Abby and I, we just stood in faith and prayed, God, if it's your will, we'll have more kids. And for a while, nothing happened. And so with all that, out of nowhere, we get pregnant. And so it's this crazy thing. It's a high risk pregnancy. So there's all these extra tests that have to be done, and ultrasounds and all that. And suddenly we find out we're having twins, and so this is like this crazy thing. Cause so we're riding high because we just had this amazing miracle of, first off, we're pregnant, let alone we got twins. And so we have this amazing thing, and it just really again, fuels that faith and that drive in life that, anything can happen. And fast forward, and Abby gets COVID at the end of the pregnancy, and she has to be sent to London Hospital to have an emergency delivery just to save the twins. And, I get sent home with the twins, and Abby has to stay in the hospital as she gets weaker. And, in those moments with all that stuff and what was happening, it was just, I reached out to the faith community around me, and I know miracles are real, and sometimes we just need to cry out to God. And people from all around the world were joining in faith, across Canada, North America, like Thailand, Brazil. I would get messages on Facebook and stuff for people that were praying, and it was just all over the place. It was just this wild. So it's people are rallying around. And so, that was that thing. And, the morning that Abby passed, I was in there in the hospital talking with the lead ICU doctor and their team, and he was explaining that Abby's dying. And it was in that moment, I'm standing in faith and, explaining, I got people praying around the world, and, I'm believing for something different, and I'm going to stand in faith. And he looked at me like I was in severe denial, or like I was losing it. It's extremely stressful, all these things, that's probably what is going on in his head as he's trying to talk me through all this stuff. And I'm turning around going, what does rehabilitation look like when she comes out of the ICU and off a ventilator and all this stuff. And so he humored me and gave me the explanation of best case scenario. And I was like, okay. And I was very matter of fact about it. And again, I think he thought I was nuts. But that's just where I was standing. I was standing in this belief. I'd experienced all these things in my life, and I just knew that this can happen. We had miracle after miracle. I'm going to believe for it. And it was one of those things that a short time later that day, I'm in the ICU, and Abby's, suffering more complications and started dying in front of me. And in those last moments, it's the struggle of faith was there. It was just I want to stand in faith, but at the same time, all these why questions are starting to flood in. And, when I reflect back on things, I think, days after the funeral, I started to struggle with the reality of life because the miracle didn't come. I started to question, why would God give me other miracles and not this one? Why would he give us this dream of 4 kids and, then have the mother gone? It didn't make any sense to me. It just plainly didn't make sense. And so the question of, why didn't God step in and intervene, kept swirling around my head. I really struggled with that. It was just this struggle of faith and understanding after seeing so much in my life. And in so many ways, the way I explain it now is I started over, with my personal faith journey. I did things like Grief Share, the support group there. Was learning about what my experience is going to be. I did counseling. I talked with pastors. All these different things that led me to, go through this faith journey and see God in all of it. I studied the Bible. I kept going to God with questions. It was one of those things where I had to just keep that in my process, was trying to see God through it all. And so as I was, reading the Bible, as I was going to him all the time, I started to get revelation. I started to get clarity, all these different things. And one thing that really sticks out to me that I learned is seeing God through the lens of his characters. You know, to simplify God in 2 words, he's good and he's loving. So when you break that down of every experience, we have that God is good and God is loving. And so many times when we live our experiences in this life, what we end up doing is we look at everything we do through the lens of our circumstances. And the way I'd like to kind of explain the lens of our circumstances is that the fact that we look at everything through a distorted lens. It's like door peepholes, and they're a fisheye. At the time they're dirty, you can't see any depth of what's really out there. You can't really see what's truly around you. You kind of have this very near field, distorted view, and that's all you have. And so, when we look at everything, we look through that lens, and we can't even really see the reality of our world. We have a world that we exist in that is still living under the curse of sin. Sin messed things up. It brought death, pain, and suffering into our lives. And that's the reality that we still live in, regardless of how everything else operates in our faith. We're still in that world. And so as I journeyed and I started, stop looking through the lens of circumstances, I started transitioning into that, taking those lenses off my eyes and really seeing through God's character. And the thing I started to understand as I would reflect on things is, whatever my experience, whether it be positive or negative, it didn't really matter. It was all those things that would transpire in my life because he's good and loving. That's still who he is. It didn't really matter, the result of what we're experiencing, because again, we're experiencing a life that's still tainted by that, but God still operates throughout this world. And so for me, as I started to again go through this journey of seeing things through the lens of God's character, what it allowed me to do is to build trust in my life. It wasn't a thing that I didn't put my trust in the understanding of everything, because there's things in this life that we truly won't understand. But as I started to see God for who he is through his character, I started to trust God. And, the why questions started to change. They started to lessen. They didn't consume me, the way they did before. I started to feel the peace of God in my life, and healing started to work its way through in my life. And for me, the question of why the miracle didn't come is, it's something I'll never truly understand. But on the other side of that, even though I didn't see this miracle, I didn't see the miracle that I asked for, even though I've had so many other miracles in my life, is I know God is still working miracles. That's another whole long video in itself I could share on. But and sometimes when we go through life, we don't often see the miracles till we look back. And that's something that I've been able to do. It's almost 4 years later now, as the shooting of this video. And so, I just want to reflect on that. I want to encourage people that that is something that is still happening and that is still a possibility with God. And when I reflect back on another thing too, is I think of one of the last songs that Abby ever led in worship in church. And because that was who she was. She was a worship leader and she declared her faith through songs. And, I look at the song was Goodness of God. And that whole song is a declaration that's bold about God's goodness and who he is. And that's something that Abby believed to the very end. Her circumstances didn't change that. And that's just the truth of who God is. And so I just want to encourage everybody today, anybody who watches this, that, we're not going to understand our circumstances, but, we can trust in a God who's good and loving, and he's still working miracles today.